God, Tara, it's a new level.
Good morning, Daily Huddle family. Giovanni said that I just broke down to a new level with my bad joke telling, but we are going to move away from jokes and talk about potentially my favorite topic this morning, which is stories. So I'd like to welcome you all first to Tuesdays on the Daily Huddle, where usually my co-host, Catherine Sable, and I are here to talk about everything communication and relationships. But she's not with us today, so I am flying solo. So I thought, what better topic to delve into than storytelling? If you know me at all, you know that I am deeply passionate about storytelling. But I want to give a little bit of history of why I'm so passionate about it and how we can incorporate it into everyday life. We tend to think about stories as during that presentation moment or that big sales pitch or when someone gives us a chance at a microphone. But stories unite us, they bind us, they make us memorable, they build trust. And they do that when we learn through practice to incorporate stories into everyday conversation. So I'd like to take you back to early on in my career when I first discovered this truth. And some of you may know, but I was put into what they call a scratch territory. It was a very competitive sales arena. I had zero business. That means scratch territory. I had zero connections, and I was competing against a very kind of white male-dominated competition. And the competition played a lot of golf with the potential customers, and they went out drinking, and they did things that I actually tried to do, and I just fell flat on my face. Well, the potential customers were high school principals, and I continued to call on high school principals, and I continued to get sales presentations, and I continued to fail. Through this journey, I watched some of my competitors and some of my colleagues offer something to their customers called student leadership conferences. They were very expensive to conduct these conferences, but I thought one day I'm going to conduct student leadership conferences because they really help to build customers. Well, the one day came, but it wasn't me hiring somebody else to give these leadership conferences. It was me learning to deliver leadership conferences on my own. So I studied the masters. I watched them tell stories. I watched every single activity that they delivered, and I learned to do it myself. I share this because at the end of every leadership conference, I would put out a survey. And the number one comment from every survey, this was long before I even knew what I was doing. The number one comment was, "I love your stories." This was back in the late 90s, and today I have never forgotten how many young people remembered me, not because of what I could teach, not because of what I had accomplished, but simply because of my stories. Stories, ladies and gentlemen, have the power to do so much, and I can go into the science of it, but for the purpose of today's conversation, I just want to talk about three things that stories have the power to do. And I'm going to share examples, and then I want to hear yours. Stories have the power to bind us and build trust. Stories have the power to help us learn, and stories have the power to cause action. So trust and connection, learning and action. Now, before I share examples of each one of those, I really want to break down what I mean when I say stories in everyday life. Most of us have a tendency, I would say all of us have a tendency to lean one way or the other, and I want to explain that and how stories can help us to lean away from this tendency. Some of us have a tendency when we're sharing to share everything positive, everything that's going wonderful. We also share what we've learned in an effort to help somebody else. For example, when someone says, I'm really dealing with a lot of stress and I can't seem to focus, somebody will inevitably pipe in and say, I take these 3 cleansing breaths and I meditate and I've learned that it helps me to focus. That's wonderful. But what the person's not sharing, which would make it memorable, is who they were and how they suffered before they discovered that solution. There's the gold. There is the story. The suffering before the lesson is what makes the person relatable, what makes us be able to trust the person, and it also helps the person, the listener, to believe that perhaps they too can learn from the lesson. But if we come into a conversation so truly and genuinely wanting to help by sharing what we've learned, if we don't give a little bit of a taste or a story of who we were before we learned this lesson, it is not nearly as memorable, and therefore it's not nearly as effective. So that's first part of everyday conversation and story. Rather than leaning in and wanting to help to tell people what we've learned, share with people who you are before you learned what you're able to share now, and it will be so much more powerful. Okay, so that's the tendency to lean totally toward positive. Some of us have another tendency, and that tendency is to share our negativity in generalities. So I'm not someone who shies away from negativity. It's a part of life. It's a fact. It's actual. But so many of us want to dust over our suffering and just maybe mention it for a couple of most common reasons. One is we feel like it sounds like whining. The only time I would really consider something whining is if we continue to stir the same soup with no solution. But to share with someone your suffering is not whining. It's being honest and truthful. So I'll give you an example. Just recently, actually, I heard someone say, and it was in a similar setting like this. It was in a podcast setting. The person said, well, I've been kind of dealing with depression, but I'm better now. And then they talked about how they got better. Depression is a word, like so many words we say when we're not careful to share stories. It is a word that can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. Some of us may see depression as just momentary sadness. Some of us may see depression as something truly chemical that we have no control over, and there's everything in between. So rather than saying, I've been dealing with some tough times, but now I've arrived, what if we were to give the person a clear example of what that depression looked like? For example, 2 weeks ago, my alarm went off like it normally did at 9 a.m. I turned it off like I normally do. And rather than laying there until noon, I got out of bed at 11 o'clock, put my clothes on, started walking in the city, stopped for a cup of tea, and in 1 hour, I was back in my bed. And while that might not sound much to many of you, that 1 hour was the most I had spent out of my apartment in a month. That is explaining to someone what perhaps depression looked like, rather than just saying, I was a little depressed and now here I am. That would be memorable. So when we are trying to express ourselves in an honest way, the very best way to do that is with story. We tend to overthink stories. We tend to want to curate them too much. And absolutely, there's a place for curating stories. But in everyday life, it is truly as simple as sharing the lessons that we've learned and sharing the part of us that tells who we were before the lesson was learned. So I would like to give 3 examples of stories showing up in life and how you might start to think about really applying more stories to conversation. One other thing I want to clarify before I dive into the 3 points, the 3 things that stories have the power to do, is I want to clarify the difference between a story and a journey. We are each on our own journey of life, and our journey is decorated by hundreds of stories. Stories are just one single transformational moment in time. And I share this because oftentimes we get so bogged down with thinking, how am I going to tell my story? You don't have a story. None of you have a story. You have hundreds of stories. And when we think about it that way, it's so much easier to break them down and share little glimpses into our life. Okay, my darlings, let's first talk about trust and building trust with story. And this is one of my favorite examples in a work setting. This was many years, well, I don't know, it was about, I don't know, 8 or so years ago. A gentleman that reported to me, he was a salesperson. He came to me and he was a very new report. So I didn't know him very well. And he came to me and he said, Tara, it has been a really long week. I've been out late night after night. My family, my kids are complaining. My wife is really not happy. I know I'm supposed to go to this conference this weekend, but I'm wondering if there's any way we could send somebody else. I feel like I need to stay home. I could have said, sure, family comes first. Go ahead. I could have said, absolutely, I understand, anything like that. But that I didn't say that. I said this to this gentleman whose name was Mark. I said, Mark, may I tell you a story? And he said, yes. And I said, years and years ago, I remember going up into my daughter Caroline's bedroom. She was about 7 years old. And at the time, I worked for a company called Herff Jones. And I went to kiss her goodnight. And she said, Mommy, tomorrow, can you help me get ready for the play? It's a dress rehearsal and I'm supposed to be the old lady. I want you to help me with my hair and my costume and finding the right glasses. And I said, oh, Caroline, I'm so sorry, honey. I'm going to be out of town for work and I won't be able to be there. And in that moment, Caroline pulled back her little tiny arm and balled up her little tiny fist, and she punched her pillow not once, but twice and a third time. And she said, I hate Herff Jones. I hate it. And that is all that I told to my friend Mark. I didn't have to tell him to take the weekend. I didn't have to tell him he had permission. I simply shared a story from my past, something that I regret. So not only did he know that he had permission not to be there, but he trusted that I really did want him to take that moment and be with his family. So next time someone asks you a question about your opinion, I want you to stop yourself before you just give it. I want you to think about how you can relate to the person's situation and share with them a lesson from your past and see how much more powerful that might be than just simply offering advice. Okay, 2 more examples, and then I want to hear some of yours. So the next thing that I mentioned that story has the power to do is to help us to learn. I don't know about you all, but I am always wanting to learn. And as many of you know, I am an autodidact when it comes to neurotransmitters. And I will tend to go off on these scientific trains talking about the science of the brain as it relates to communication and human behavior. And sometimes when I do that, people's eyes may glaze over. One thing that I really love to talk about is the connection between dopamine and endorphins. So I'm going to give you an example, and then I'm going to tell the story that will hopefully help you to remember this. Our brain is always seeking a reward. We are constantly seeking reward. That's what our brain is looking to do. We're looking for relief, reward, or escape. It is the neurotransmitter dopamine that keeps us focused on the win, whether it's a video game or getting the next sale or getting to the next chocolate chip muffin at the end of the day or a cup of coffee or alcohol or the Peloton. Dopamine is that anticipation hormone that keeps us wanting, and we are going after something. One of the most powerful things that we can go after with the motivation of dopamine is something called endorphins. Endorphins explodes in our body when we need relief from pain. And the most common time that this takes place is during exercise. Also during intimacy, but we won't go there right now. We're just going to stick with exercise. One of the most, you've probably heard of something called a runner's high. Well, when we get into a certain place in exercise, endorphins fire off and they relieve pain. That's what helps us to keep going. So I could stop there and hopefully you'll remember the power of dopamine, but I do want to share one of my favorite memories of the power of the dopamine endorphin relationship. This was about 5 or 6 years ago, and my husband was living in Northern California near San Francisco, and I was living in Atlanta, and we were doing this bi-coastal thing, and it was hard and it was romantic, but when we were together, we really worked hard to really take care of that time together. Well, It was one particular work day. I jumped on the train to go to San Francisco from actually San Mateo, where the house was, and spend a long day working and talking to some new prospects. On the way home on the train, I was wiped out. But what kept me going all day was that I was headed to a spin class. I kept looking forward to that spin class where I just could feel the stress of the day wash away. So I'm on the train headed back home and my phone rings. And it was my husband. And he says, "Hey, guess what?" I said, "What?" And he said, "I'm already home. I got off early, came home." And I thought, well, great. We're going to be able to spend the whole evening together. And so I decided to skip the spin class and I hung up the phone. And my mood started changing dramatically. I just got grouchier and grouchier and grouchier. I knew what it was. All that dopamine and no reward. I was looking forward to the endorphins from that spin class, and my husband unknowingly had snatched it away from me. So I called him back and I explained to him what was going on in my biology, and he said, "Oh, please go on to that spin class. I do not want to go to dinner with a little beepity beep anyway." So that is an example of how dopamine powers through us and the relationship with endorphins. Our brain is seeking relief. And if it's taken away, if you think that you're going to get home and find that last piece of pizza in the refrigerator and somebody ate it, that's another example of the power of dopamine and the reward being taken away. So focus on that sometimes through your communication. Okay, the last example might be one of my favorite stories that I like to tell. And this one is shows the power of causing people to act. And I want to share that somebody came to me recently, and I do tell this story often, and it's actually a little piece in my book, and I'm going to read it to you. But I had an occasion to tell this story recently because someone shared with me that she wanted to move, and she was afraid. She said, "No one's ever really moved away from our family. We've always had Sundays together. I've always been surrounded by cousins, brothers, sisters, aunts, and uncles. I've got this new opportunity, but I'm going to move across the country, and I'm really afraid that it's going to be hard. I won't be able to do it by myself. And I'm also afraid that I'm going to be sad and that I'm going to miss my family so much that I won't be able to function." I told her that I learned something when I was a little girl. I didn't tell her that it wouldn't be sad. I actually said, it's going to be sad, but it's going to be worth it. And this is the story that I told her, and I would like to read it to you. If I can find it here, let's see. I still have vivid memories of learning to get myself where I want to go. The first was when I was 6 or 7 years old. Not older than 7, because I know that we moved to South Carolina in the spring after my 7th birthday. We were living in Baltimore in a suburb where at the end of the street was an Episcopal church. My mom had taken us a time or two, but it was far from consistent. She was a night owl who struggled to get up in the morning, and my dad always left early for golf. So I decided to get myself to Sunday school. After a breakfast of honeycombs and whole milk, I began the challenge of wriggling into thick white tights. The struggle was rewarded as I buttoned up a fancy dress made for twirling and buckled my feet into black patent leather shoes. They shimmered in the morning sun as I walked myself down the street to the church. I knew how to find the second grade classroom where little wooden chairs were tucked neatly under tables. The smell of glue and crayons lured me into my seat amid the bins that were organized with construction paper, pipe cleaners, and miniature scissors. I was instantly captivated by a story. The teacher was a young woman who cradled the storybook with long fingernails painted in a rebellious green. She had flowing, silky brown hair and earrings that jangled softly as she placed Nilla wafers onto paper napkins and poured Kool-Aid into tiny Dixie cups after the prayer. It was only the end of Sunday school that I dreaded. which is probably why I remember it so clearly. When class was dismissed, I would take my tiny purse and my art project and pretend to do what all the other children did. Look for my parents so we could go into the church service together. I stood on tiptoes and peered around crowds as if I was looking for my family. But when the other parents took their children's hands and walked into the sanctuary, I walked back home. I read that story recently to my husband, and he just said, "That is sad." And it is sad. But the point of the story is the sad was worth it to me. At 7 years old, something drew me to that church. Nobody wanted to get up and take me. So I took myself, and the sad was worth it. So I hope this morning I have shared some examples of opening your heart and sharing the stories from your life, the struggles, the heartache, how you overcame them. And those I truly believe will be much more powerful lessons and connections with the people in your life. So I'm wondering if anybody has any thoughts or ideas or questions about stories and conversation.
Can we just speak randomly? Oh, I see Cece had her hand up.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Gio, but go ahead, whoever's voice that is. I can't see whose voice that is.
That was me, Stan.
Oh, hey, Stan.
Hey, good morning. Good morning, Tara. Good morning, Mastermind and Daily Huddle family. What really stood out for me is not a story that I want to tell, but just the importance of really, really writing down your thoughts. The importance of really, really, really journaling. Because if you hadn't done that, you wouldn't have what you did by, having this story to tell is evident to us and shareable to us because you did write it down. And I don't think that before you saying this just now, that I really ever, as much as I've heard it and even have advised it, realized just how important journaling could actually is.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're going to tell stories, you got to have it helps to have the stories written down. Thank you.
Thank you for saying that. As a matter of fact, I had in my notes, and I didn't say it, that preparation it's caring about the people that you're communicating with. But I've never really thought about it as in relation to actually journaling. I love that. It makes so much sense. It is our memories. We don't even realize what we learned from our memories sometimes until we express them. And I love the idea of just connecting your ability to tell better stories to journaling. So thank you. That's excellent. I think Giovanni's hand was up next.
Yeah, Tara, thank you for sharing this wonderful stories. And I was present to my experience as you were sharing them, right? Because what I was noticing as from the beginning, from when you were starting to share what the students remember of you. Don't quite remember the story, but they do remember how you make them feel through the stories. And what a powerful connection, what a lifetime connection that a story is. And so I'm discovering in today's episode, or in your episode today, is that perhaps something that I have not been mastering is storytelling. And I am committed to make a lasting impact. And I am discovering today is that I've got to take a look at what stories connect with the message I want to give. And so that's what I'm discovering. Yeah.
I love that you shared that. Thank you. It just goes back to what I just feel like I can never say often enough is before you share what you know, share a piece of yourself before you knew it. That makes it memorable. We've learned so much in our lifetime, but who we were and how we suffered before we knew it, there's the story, right? If not, we might just come over as a know-it-all. Good morning, Sorrel. And I see Cece, your hand's up too. I think Sorrel was next, and then Cece.
Good morning, Tara. So before I learned from you about storytelling, I was afraid to share my story because when it made me sad, I thought that people would see me as weak.
Hmm.
And I took a leap.
Wow.
It was a while back, Tara. I wrote a story about my upbringing in Haiti, how I was raised, who my parents were for me, and all that. And 2 days ago, somebody read that. And she said, I was crying while I was reading that. And I said, I was crying when I wrote it.
Mm.
Oh,
So even now, it brings the whole world here, right? And what I'm embracing and loving with you about storytelling is this, that maybe there's nothing else to share except my stories and your stories. And perhaps that's just the biggest contribution we could ever make.
Wow.
So,
deep.
before,
That's deep.
and it dawned on me kind of yesterday in that conversation, right? Like I've always prided myself in knowing something and having something to contribute.
mhm.
And as I practice, Tara, people kind of go like this when I share what I know. They go, "Oh, thank you for the reminder."
Mm.
And so I'm becoming attuned to that. So whenever I hear "thank you for the reminder," I go, "Oh, I just haven't shared myself. I just shared what I know." So I'm becoming more and more. I'm practicing more and more sharing my stories, and I know when I'm sharing my stories because they touch me too.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's right. People can feel that. I mean, the word authenticity today is just thrown around so often that we don't hear it like we used to, but people can really sense when we're being genuine and when we're just like plasticky,
Yeah.
scripted. Yeah. So dusting over our experiences does not feel authentic. And that's why I love story. One of the many reasons. So, oh, it's 9:30 and I definitely want to close this out. So Cece, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you so much for being so transparent and showing love towards us with your storytelling. I'm one of the ones that was afraid and ashamed to tell my story, and when I would write it down, it was scribbled. So the scribble came from a neurological issue that I was unaware of because I was diagnosed with quote unquote depression, and it never was depression. It mimicked it. It mimicked it. And I recently learned what the neurological issue was. And now I'm able to proceed forward in life where for over 60 years, I didn't know how to express myself authentically. I was scribbling and I couldn't remember, short-term things. And so the way you describe in how you share is like a beautiful gift to give to somebody else. And I'd like to be able to just do a little about the little that I learned today is a great opening for me to learn to do the same thing. So thank you so much, everybody, for sharing your love towards us. And
Oh, beautiful. Thank you for sharing that, Cece. Thank you so much. What a beautiful example of sharing a little bit of your stories. I want to leave you with one final thought about the power of story and to remind you that when we are sharing suffering, something that we're not proud of, a struggle, something that brings us shame, anything that we work so hard to conceal, it causes stress in the minds of the other person. But when we do share it, it is not whining, it is not complaining, it is sharing facts. And when we have the courage to do that, it gives us something that I think we all could use a giant dose of, and that is freedom. Take some pride in your past, whatever it was, however you responded to it. You are standing tall today, and your strength came from your suffering. And when we have the courage to share that, that lets us breathe in freedom. This has been a delight. I love talking about story, and I thank you all for so much collaboration. And I want to end with our 7 tenets. Of course, the first is to love. And when you share of yourself and your truth, that is loving. That is also giving. So remember to give of yourself and of your truth and of your time and of your heart. And don't take yourself too seriously. As I always say, let your head fall back. You can also get endorphins from gut-wrenching laughter. Take care of your body. That means to get up and move your body. Make sure you get sleep, stress less, and fill it up with mostly plants and water. Thank you all so much for being here on the Daily Huddle. We'll see you tomorrow at 9 a.m. Eastern Time.
Wow. Thank you, Tara.
Thank you all for being here in such collaboration.
Thank you. Thank you, Daily Huddle family. Thank you.